So instead of using that, it was actually easier just to poke a bigger hole in it and then just blow in it. And I have a small leak here. I got a small leak over here. And right there's a leak, and there might be one over there, but there's definitely one there. So I'm going to go ahead and fix those and then see where it's leaking in. Okay, finally wrapping up the oil cooler install. Got the filter, draining the oil out of it, because I need to change that too while I'm here. I just wanted to show all of this because the oil filter is going to be blocking it here pretty quick, but there is the adapter that's held in there with that big bolt that the oil filter screws to. There's my two oil lines coming out of it. The insulated one is the return from the cooler, and I wrapped it up just so I wasn't putting heat back into the already cooled oil, especially because it's the closest one to the header. Here on the header you can see we welded it there and moved it over, and then further up there we cut it again so that we could bend it towards the frame rail from this perspective. And then the lines both run right under the motor mount between the engine and the header, all the way up to the front there, which I guess we'll look at in a second. Grab this filter. I got the filter lubed up. New AC Delco filter. I'll get the number for it here in a second. Actually, does this say the number on it? PF2232 is the size of the filter. The big filter. So I could get the oil filter on. Oh, and I had to dent the header right here too. So I could get the filter on there before, but that header tube that we had to move was just almost touching it. I mean, it was like 4 sheets of paper maybe. But now I can actually get my finger in between it and the filter, and then I dented this down here so that wherever it went, my little tool that I made in another video that grips the oil filter, because I dented the tube, I can still get that on there, because I had a problem because that sandwich plate up here moved the whole filter down about 1.5 inches, and so I couldn't get the tool past the header, and I had to use the tool again to get the other oil filter off, even though I didn't put it on as tight as the first one that I had to, tear off. But in case I have to do that with this one too, I just wanted to make sure I could get that tool on there, so I dented the header. I can get that on there. This thing's got some oil leaks going on. The transmission leaks pretty bad from that rear seal. I'm not messing with that anytime soon though. There you can see the whatever conversion shift thing pretty good. That converts the 3 on the tree steering column to run the whatever 4L60E here. Cable runs all the way around through the engine bay. Kind of see all the major stuff from here. We had to cut that header over there too to move it over, kind of similar to this one, but to clear the knock sensor. Yep, got the header back, all the exhaust back together too, but I'm going to tighten this up, put the plug back in it, put some oil in it, and then we'll look at the front and start it. So before I go over the whatever and start this thing, because I got to cover some stuff up that I want to talk about first. But this is stuff for anybody who doesn't know. This obviously is not stock. All of this came from a 99 Tahoe, as did this giant fuse down here. If I can get the light, it'll be a little easier to see. So this mega fuse here, ironically the brand is called Little Fuse, is a 175 amp fuse that came from the Tahoe, and it goes between the positive side of the battery and the alternator originally. And because we needed power, and the only other place to attach power to is the starter way down there, and that's just a pain to get to, and I didn't want to mess with any of that, so we just bolted, because this is a lock nut. Let's see, this wire here is one that my dad put on there whenever we first got the truck going, and I don't know what it goes to. The part of it is the alternator signal wire to energize the alternator, and then the rest of it runs up in here. That might be power for the ECU. I bet that's what that is. And then this wire down here is the one that I added, and that's my power for the fan, and it runs down under the hose and then runs parallel along with the overfill tube there. So now we can go down here and follow that. So there's our wiring harness. It runs right down here. Out of it comes the whatever grounding wire for our little temp switch here, which I'd have to double check, but I'm pretty sure this thing, it comes on, it triggers the fan to come on at about 180 degrees. I could be wrong about that. I'd have to go double check that. And I mounted it down so that it fills up with oil and doesn't get air locked, and then it just grounds here to the bracket. I use nylock nuts on everything so that hopefully nothing will fall off. These oil cooler lines here that I made up, they're the original ones from the Tahoe, and I just cut the ends up and bent them and did everything with them to make them fit, and they fit pretty good. Yeah, they're wrapped around, or the heater core line. The power steering line wraps around them, but the power steering line was like that to begin with because for a 73, it's not made to go with that power steering pump, which is from the Tahoe. Power steering pump's from the Tahoe. And I guess the astute Chevy person will start screaming that that power steering pump uses an O-ring fitting, and I said that line is from a 73, which is a flare fitting. So how does that work, you ask? I don't know where I got it from. I don't remember because it's been well over a year. But I found a little brass fitting that you put an O-ring in the pump, you slide the little fitting in, and it's basically a little adapter that goes from an O-ring to a flare. So that is what is in between the pump and that flare on the line, is that little conversion fitting that you just push right back into the pump fitting. And so that's how I have a flare line hooked up to a pump that originally had an O-ring line. So if I wanted to, being that that's a flare, I can make a new line that just runs straight up and around and doesn't have to come do this crazy stuff. But I have no intention of messing with anything else on this thing for a little bit, because it's been down for like 3 weeks now, and I would kind of like just to drive it again. So yep, all these fittings came from Lowe's, because it's just the easiest place to get them. Hopefully it all works out fine. This disaster here, ignore all of that, because that's still an ongoing fiasco. That'll come up later. And then I added these, I think that's 1/8 inch. I think it's 1/8 inch. Might be 3/16, but I think it's 1/8 inch. Little gussets, or whatever you want to call them here. So these are going to help keep the bumper stiff in this area. And then these pieces here are actually slotted a little bit where it bolts up to the cooler, so the bracket can move forward a little bit without actually shoving on the cooler. So that should help keep that, safe and alive. In worst case scenario, because I plan on keeping oil and stuff in this thing, I could unscrew the filter, take the sandwich plate off, and then screw the filter back on, and it would bypass this whole cooler, and then I would just have to put oil back in it. So as much of a pain as that would be, that's what I could do as well. Back to the wiring. This plug here did not come with the kit I bought. I'll go whatever, all the paperwork's up there, I'll go over it later. The male plug that came with the kit, the wires were already like horrifically brittle, like they sounded like a glow stick. Whenever you bent them, they just cracked, and I didn't trust them. So this plug actually probably originally came from this truck, and I don't know, it popped in there, and so I'm just using it. But yeah, so my power wire that we were looking at earlier that runs over to that giant fuse runs up to the relay, which we will look at now. And then here's the fan. Side note on the fan, this fan's not made to go with this cooler, and it just barely fit. I mean, I had to drill new holes for it all the way around, and it was just barely enough to not contact the whatever the very outside fins or whatever they are. So you could probably go with a fan that's a little bit bigger, but this one did fit pretty nice. So here is where the wiring comes up, right here. And I'm going to get another one of these clamps to clamp the wiring harness to that convenient bolt that's sitting there doing nothing. And it runs up to this fuse. And then, actually this fuse is in line with the power to the fan. that big power wire that runs over to that mega freaking giant fuse is this red wire here, runs up to the relay, and then this is power going back to the fan is this fuse here. And then the sensor wire to trigger the fan to come on, it also comes up here, hooks up to the fan, and then the ignition wire that the switch down there grounds, that ignition wire is these two green wires here. I split it and it runs into the cab. Yep, my light's cut. It comes through up there somewhere, but here you can see it right there. Those two green wires I was talking about, they come in and they hook up to this green LED. Because ideally I'd like to have a gauge, but I already have oil pressure, temp, whatever, and I'm going to put a voltage one there eventually. And I didn't want to have any gauges hanging down. I didn't like any of that, so ideally I would want an oil temp gauge, but being that there's not room for one, I just put this light in. So this light will only come on when the fan is on. So if that, because its power is basically coming from here, runs out to the relay, and then it splits and runs through the light and down and then to the switch. So for when the relay is triggered on, that light is going to be on. So if the light is always on, that means the oil is always hot and something's wrong. Or if the light never comes on, then it means either the oil is cold all the time for whatever reason, or it means the whole system isn't working. So that'll just be my little check system there. If that light is just, you know, kind of turning on for a while, turning off for a while, then that should be working pretty normal function. And then here, because there's only one, I love these trucks in the fact that they come with a little slot on the fuse box just to tie ignition wire, you know, ignition power into, because it's so much of a pain to find power on some other cars. But I have a bunch of stuff already running off of it, and so this 30 amp circuit breaker came with the kit for the fan, and they said to use it on this ignition wire for whatever reason. And so what I did is I tied that ignition wire, and I'm using this relay just like how I'm using that fuse in the engine bay as just kind of a junction block basically. So the only thing that's protected by that 30 amp circuit breaker is just the whatever energizing wire for the relay for the fan, and then the rest of it is just stuff like this little horn thing, which I'll go over with, that buzzes whenever the lights are on. That's the power wire that's powering it. This gray wire here runs and powers the oil light and the alternator warning light, and also by default energizes the alternator. So that's pretty much that. Change oil, I already did that. So I'm letting it sit for a little bit because I goofed and I forgot to fill the oil filter up, and so all the oil lines are empty, the cooler's empty, now the filter's empty. So that was what I didn't want to do, but I've already put oil in it now and I don't want to risk taking the filter off and dumping oil everywhere. So I pulled the fuel pump relay out of it, and that way I'm just going to crank it over a little bit and just try and fill everything up and let it build a little bit of oil pressure, check for leaks before and then start it. And hopefully I should have the firing order right, but if I don't, I have no doubt the computer will tell me. And on a side note, for anybody who has messed with headers on an engine like this, you will know that this spark plug right here, and it's probably, I think it's the same on the other side, but number, what is that, 135? Number 5 is a pain to get to because you can't fit one of these sockets on it because the socket hits the header. But if you invest in one of these, whatever, this is just a Husky brand, this will slide all the way over the socket so that you can, this will slide all the way over the spark plug so you can get it just right all the, you know, past the header and then all the way down to the whatever hex on the socket and take it off, tighten it, do whatever. So that was a lifesaver. I've had that for a while and I never even used it until now, but that is a worthwhile tool if you have that problem that you're dealing with. This is the easiest way I've ever seen to do that. Otherwise, trying to do that with a normal wrench is just almost impossible. So that socket makes it a lot easier. See that it's not leaking, because hopefully it won't be leaking. Got the door up. Yeah, let's see, I put the drain plug in. Well, that should be good. Put the fuel pump relay back in it. Okay, so this will be, I don't even know how long this is going on. This will be at least 3 weeks since this thing started. Keep an eye on the oil pressure gauge. Okay, well, it's definitely, I got good pressure. Leaks? Not yet. Okay, so far so good. Just let it idle for a little bit. The other thing I did, if you can hear me, is I welded a nut between those two header tubes to hold them together, because they kept wanting to spread apart a little bit. The one that I had to move is now welded to the other one, because it kept wanting to move away. So I got good oil pressure. Cool. Okay, well, let's shut it off and check the oil again. So the engine had good oil pressure, as you saw. I checked the oil, and it is quite low. It had good oil pressure, so I'm not too worried about it, but it definitely, this whole system takes well over 5 quarts now, which, hey, fine by me. More oil, cool. Better than less, I guess. But I think I'm going to have to add maybe another quart to it, so it might be a 6 quart capacity now. Hopefully it'll just be close to a round number, that'd be nice. But so far, no leaks, which is awesome. And the oil pressure looked good. So gotta go get more oil. Running 5W30 synthetic in it now, because this is, for whatever reason, Mobil 1 quit selling, or stores quit stocking the conventional 5W30, which is what we always put in all of this stuff. But whatever, they're only gonna sell synthetic, that's fine. They'll run synthetic in it, it'll probably only be good for it. But yep, so I gotta go get that. Put some more oil in it, be back in a second. Okay, I finally got the fan to kick on. As you can see, the little light is on. The fan's running. And it moves quite a bit of air. So now that we know the oil's as hot as it's gonna get, put it in gear. And we are right under 30 psi. Oil light is staying off, so that's good. Because I don't know if I mentioned this before, but the main reason I did this is in gear at a hot idle, it was just barely tickling 15 psi, which was enough to barely trigger the oil light that I put in. And after all that, it's running at 188 degrees. It took me about 20 minutes of letting it run here and holding it at, for a while I was holding it at about 1500 RPM to get it warmed up. But anyways, so the oil was getting really hot from having the oil filter so close to the header. That's why I moved the header over whenever I did this as well. And so now the cooler appears to work. Everything seems to be good. So I think I'll go drive it around and see how it works. Okay, well, right off the bat it seems to be working pretty good. I just drove across town a little ways, and ordinarily the needle would be right at about 15 psi there, and this light would just be barely flashing. But the oil warning light's off. We have a little less than 30 psi instead of 15. So apparently it made a huge difference in keeping the oil
at a more constant temperature, so the oil's staying cooler and staying a little bit thicker. And I never actually saw for myself the light come on the drive over here. I think there might actually just be enough air pushing between the grill and the bumper to keep the oil cool enough that it doesn't actually trigger the light. I imagine if I sat here long enough, it'd probably turn on like it did in the garage, but regardless, it's still keeping really good oil pressure now, so that's nice.